For the chalice lighting this morning, I want to share a poem from the hymnal. It's number 536 if you wish to follow along. It's called Morning Poem by Mary Oliver. Every morning the world is created. Under the orange sticks of the sun, the heaped ashes of the night turn into leaves again and fasten themselves to the high branches, and the ponds appear like black cloth on which are painted islands of summer lilies. If it is your nature to be happy, you will swim away along the soft trails for hours, your imagination alighting everywhere. And if your spirit carries within it the thorn that is heavier than lead, if it's all you can do to keep on trudging, there is still somewhere deep within you a beast shouting that the earth is exactly what it wanted. Each pond with its blazing lilies is a prayer heard and answered lavishly every morning. Whether or not you have ever dared to be happy, whether or not you have ever dared to pray, we light our chalice in the spirit of that beast within. A reading by Wendell Berry. When despair for the world grows in me and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day blind starts waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free.
It's nice to be back in Rochester. My GPS told me today that it has been 1 year since I graced this highway from Minneapolis, so it's good to be back. The sounds of those seeking sanctuary vary. Some are loud, like the hunchback of Notre Dame as he swooped down on a rope from that Catholic church in Paris. When Charles Laughton in the title role sees Maureen O'Hara as Esmeralda, about to be hung for being a witch, he swings over to rescue her from the executioner and takes her back to the church sanctuary. Some of you who remember these black and white movies are nodding their head in remembrance of actors that some of us don't know anything about. But we can see that scene, seeking sanctuary. Sanctuary, sanctuary is what he says, and the crowd goes wild. The sounds of sanctuary can also be like whispers heard as stockings' feet go up a wooden stairs to where Anne Frank and her family lived. In 1999, on my way to Kenya, I stopped in Amsterdam to see the sights. In taking that infamous tour, I walked behind that bookcase up those narrow steps, and I remember not saying a thing and looking behind me, feeling the potential onslaught of Nazi soldiers. While in those tiny rooms, I imagined the silence that would be required for me to live in this sanctuary. Sanctuary. I remember my great-grandfather talking about how his uncle had emancipated himself one night from the brutality of enslavement. Somehow he just slipped off into the night, seeking sanctuary in a swamp, breathing through a reed of a straw, sucking oxygen bubbles as he sought sanctuary in anaerobic bacteria. Things have got to be really bad for someone to seek sanctuary. To leave one's home, to find refuge in another place. Imagine having to pull your roots up tomorrow and leave everything that you've ever known behind, everything that you've ever valued, everything that you've ever built, to leave it all behind. How could you do this? How? Because people seeking sanctuary believe that there is a worthwhile something better. Something is worthwhile, and there is something better. Better than the horror that is facing them or coming after them. It could be crop failure, perpetual unemployment, untreatable diseases, state violence, or the poor preying upon the poor. Whatever the reason, the need to protect oneself and one's loved ones is probably the greatest example of human affirmation we can ever witness. An even greater human assertion is their belief that there is something better for me and my family. The Franks in Amsterdam knew that there had to be something better than the scientific and systematic extermination of the Jews. My great-grandfather's uncle knew that he was sucking air from that reed, that something had to be better than being treated worse than a hated dog. Those migrants walking from Central America know that there must be something better, a place for their children to be safe from the continued, unrelenting, purposeful destabilization of their countries. You see, there is something special about those seeking sanctuary, because everybody does not leave. Think about it. The group walking to freedom is a tiny fraction of the people in Central America. There are over 20 million people in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. Everybody doesn't leave the plantations of enslavement. Some Jews thought that the Nazi phase would pass, and they stayed put. What is it about these people who leave that makes them seek sanctuary? I believe that they are set apart by two things. First, they are set apart because they are self-motivated by their own moral imagination. They believe that their inherent worth and dignity is non-negotiable. It's non-negotiable. Their lives and the lives of those they care for are worth taking the needed risks. Moral imagination means to envision a full range of possibilities in a particular situation in order to solve an ethical challenge. Think about it. The social structures have been designed to fail those seeking sanctuary. They failed the German Jews and then the American Jews, the same sanctuary that failed enslaved Africans and then free blacks. And they have failed the compañeras of Central America and the DACA kids in Los Angeles. But they still imagine righteousness, equity, and fairness. Freedom has always been a precarious thing for black and brown people who stood on the legal margins of society. Blackness, particularly, and enslavement were firmly connected in antebellum America, that to be free and black was to exist as a civic anomaly. It takes moral imagination against all of those odds to survive perpetual systems of dehumanization. Now, sanctuary seekers also have self-empathy and the awareness to discern what is morally relevant in a given situation. The very act of seeking sanctuary is the spark that ignites the flame of moral imagination. A moral imagination to envision new and creative alternatives. I can see myself as a free person. I can see myself as safe. I can see myself as worshiping my chosen faith. People seeking sanctuary also have the moral courage to see themselves as human beings and as persons, not as objects whose value rests in the utility or usefulness of others. Now, in many ways, seeking sanctuary is a process by which an individual creates metaphors from images recorded by the senses of basic humanity. Basic humanity gives us this imagination. These senses are stored in memory, which are then surfaced so that a person who is suffering can bring forth moral correspondence from their family's history, but bring it forth in lived experience. Now, this requires them having an intuitive belief that truth can be found in chaos, and that there is hope for the proper ordering of the soul and the proper ordering of society. Now, I believe in addition to moral imagination, these people seeking sanctuary are set apart also by a sense of generativity, a term that was coined years ago by old Erik Erikson in 1950 to denote a concern for establishing a guide for the next generation. It describes a need to nurture and guide the next generation towards purposefulness. People seeking sanctuary want to first have their children and their community survive. To survive. Now, by providing them then with safe harbor, they seek to care and teach the next generation their stories and beliefs and accomplishments. I remember my great-grandfather, who lived to be 103, born right after the Emancipation, telling me through his moral imagination that the Emancipation was just a coffee break for Black people. And I remember that to this very day. When I was 10 years old in 1969, he told me that this was just a coffee break. His generativity, his moral imagination, he wanted to show me, his descendant, that our continued existence mattered. And one of the greatest memories of generativity for Black people in America was a period called Reconstruction after slavery, after the Civil War. Now, the first thing that these quasi-free Black people did right after the Emancipation, right after slavery, right after the Civil War ended, the first thing that all these folks did was go searching for their family members who had been sold off into other places. I've heard these stories in my family about people who searched and found, and they were all went looking for their children and their partners and their loved ones. That was the first thing that everybody did. And as they sought to find these families, they banded together and made new family along the roadsides in swamps and burnt-out plantations, seeking refuge as landless people with absolutely no rights. But very quickly, their moral imagination and their generativity, in 50 years, all over the country, these bands of illiterate, homeless people built Black towns throughout the South and the West as they sought sanctuary from the brutality of this country. Now, following World War I and during the oil boom of the 1910s, the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma was one of those towns, recognized nationally as an affluent African-American community. 50 years out of slavery. This thriving business district and surrounding residential area was referred to as Black Wall Street. In fact, the district was so successful that a dollar would stay within the district an estimated 17 months before being spent elsewhere. Not only did Black Americans want to contribute to their own success and through their own shops, because there was no other alternative because of racial segregation laws that prevented them from shopping anywhere other than Greenwood. They ran oil wells, built civic organizations, churches, and political structures that generated this excitement and moral imagination, and basically an opportunity for them to franchise themselves into the American system. Now, Greenwood may have been a haven for African Americans, but the state of Oklahoma had strict laws limiting the rights of black people in schools, hospitals, trains, stores, restaurants, just basically everything in life. Lynchings were not uncommon, and if you know, by the 1920s, the Klan was emerging in that state to a horrific degree. Now, despite all of that, we know the history, we know the horror. Despite all of that, they had the moral imagination to see themselves of worth and dignity, and those sanctuaries thrived. Until there's, in spite of and until are two sort of American storylines that we have to always use in history. Until May 31st, 1921. And 6-year-old Olivia Hooker was home with her family when a group of white men came through the backyard carrying torches. Her mother quickly hid Olivia and her 3 siblings under the dining room table and covering them with a tablecloth and told them not to make a sound. The men entered the house and began to destroy anything they could find of value. They broke her father's record player, a prized possession, and took an axe to her sister's beloved piano before moving on to other homes and businesses in the community. The New York Times at the time reported that fires had been started by hundreds of white invaders soon after 1 o'clock, and other fires were set from time to time. By 8 o'clock, practically entire 30 blocks of homes of the Negro quarters were in flames, and few buildings escaped destructions. Negroes caught in their burning homes and businesses were in many instances shot down as they attempted to escape. Hundreds of black people murdered, 6,000 arrested for creating their own sanctuary town. No sanctuary for Greenwood, and also no sanctuary for Rosewood, Florida, or Bridgeton, New Jersey, where my family is from, or from the colored children's home in New York City that was burnt down in 1923. No sanctuary. But in spite of this, Olivia Hooker, that little girl underneath the table, went on to demonstrate the moral imagination and generativity found in those that live without sanctuary. In 1945, Olivia Hooker became the first African-American woman to join the United States Coast Guard. She went on to get a doctorate in psychology and helped form the Tulsa Race Riot Commission in 1997 to investigate the massacre and make a case for reparations. Dr. Hooker is 103 years old at my last count, still living, and she's the last surviving witness to the Tulsa race riot of 21. In Dr. Hooker's testimony, she talked about the joy of her home in Greenwood. And you can go on YouTube, actually, and see some really old black and white footage of the joy of this prosperous town taking care of themselves. Like so many, she knew that sanctuary was a constant source of joy and happiness for her. But they were also in a constant state of vigilance, always looking both ways, always worried about being caught, always worried about being found out, always worried about being threatened, always worried about being wiped out. Now, this liminal nature of sanctuary space makes them very temporary. A sanctuary, but for how long? Sanctuaries are not permanent. They're created in an emergency. They're responded to quickly, but they are not meant to be permanent. Friends, I have to share something with you, and I do it with an open heart. And I hope you remain open with me as I do this. And you've heard me preach here before, and I authentically enjoy American history and the idea of America as a unique historical set of constellations. Yet, despite, I hold these democratic aspirations in complete and continued tension, because we, the children of enslaved Africans, We, the foundational human engine that created American wealth, we, the people of a darker hue, we have no safe space. Friends, know that I have never experienced a feeling of sanctuary in this country, ever. I believe the perilous and insidious day-to-day realities of being black in America has altered, and I really tell my friends this, I said, I think it has altered our brain chemistry to the point that we have been recalibrated to be immune from some fanciful vision that we could ever be safe here. And as a result, I do not yearn for that impossible day where I can rest my burdens and my ancestors' burdens down. I do not hope for it because 400 years this year is the anniversary of the first arrival of Africans in North America, because 400 years of fantasies place very strange and real limitations on my sanity. And I like being relatively sane, but it places limitations on it. Yet there is a gift in all of this, friends. Because of this lack of sanctuary, my moral imagination and passionate generativity rises above and subverts the intent of those who would deny me sanctuary. Given the limited resources that black folks have to work with, given the odds, given the constant debasing of our very souls, look what we have done. Look what we have done. Our moral imagination is evident in jazz, in literature, in art, in philosophy, in religion, in science, in engineering, in politics. You name it, you will find some quiet, unassuming black person who made a way out of no way. Despite the obstacles we have and do face, we have, many of us, and as a people, survived. Black lives matter despite sanctuary. We have learned to take jargon like the Negro problem, many of you remember that book, a famous book from the 60s, into a new thing called Black joy and Black girl magic. Look it up, you'll get happy. Despite sanctuary, we know who we are. Despite sanctuary, we love ourselves. Think about this. If black people are at the bottom of everything in terms of life indicators, disparities, the black woman is probably at the bottom of every statistic. Yet, who has the lowest suicide rate in America? Black women. Those with the highest suicide rate? White men. Despite living in in fact, the Center for Disease Control now has already classified a new kind of death called deaths of despair. It's a category at the CDC if you go to their website, and it describes the type of people that are dying of these deaths of despair. Despite living in a society that has and never will honor my blackness as sacred enough to hold me in complete and unconditional humanness, my worldview is shaped by and informed by and guided by the generativity of our great unparalleled story of a people. We are a people that have been invented by Italian navigation, Spanish greed, the King James Bible, and the disorganized thinking about humanity called racism. I am a creation that never existed before. If you look at my DNA, which we all can look at now thanks to Ancestry.com, 23andMe, when I look at it and I see this creation, this constellation of countries and continents in Europe and Africa, I see that I was a creation made by these things, by these events, by these decisions. Yet, you can't wipe us out, no matter what. We still here. I always sort of felt like black people are like that persistent little mouse you have in the kitchen. That persistent little mouse you just cannot get away. You try to bomb it, you try traps, you try sprays, you try sonic booms, and there she is at 3 in the morning when you're coming down for a snack, eating your Thai food on the counter. That's like us. We still here. always surviving and sometimes thriving without sanctuary. As I close, I want to extend a reminder, a challenge, and an invitation to you. The reminder from our Unitarian Universalist history, which we need to read much more of. On November 1st, 1850, The Liberator, the Boston anti-slavery newspaper, published by William Lloyd Garrison, a radical Unitarian white abolitionist, he alerted local residents to the persistence and the presence of two prowling villains. It said that the two slave catchers had come to Boston from Macon, Georgia, with the aim of capturing William and Ellen Craft, a runaway enslaved couple, under the infernal fugitive slave law. And their intent was to carry them back to the hell of slavery. Prompted by the Crafts' plight, Boston's black community, along with Garrison and some of these other radical abolitionists, gathered a plan about their opposition to the fugitive slave law locally, and they adopted a set of resolutions, including a pledge to resist oppression, and in a complex maze of hide and seek that took place right there around Beacon Hill. And any attacks on their freedom, in the very first issue of his anti-slavery newspaper, William Lloyd Garrison stated, "I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch. I will be heard." And Garrison was heard. And for more than 3 decades, from the first issue of his weekly paper in 1831 until the end of the Civil War in 1865, when the last issue was published, Garrison spoke out eloquently and passionately against slavery and for the rights of America's black inhabitants to have sanctuary. Friends, at this church, we need to be reminded, and I'm going to remind you to be an ally with a pen and or your voice. Use your access, use your resources, and be heard. Be heard. Now the invitation. Educate yourself. How many of you have a good, strong understanding about Reconstruction in this country? 3 people, not good enough. Okay, study. Read, learn, educate yourself, and go home and look at the Black Joy Project and the Black Girl Magic Project, and read Audre Lorde, and listen to the speeches by Black humanists on YouTube, and go see If Beale Street Could Talk, and read slave narratives from the Smithsonian, listen to gospel music, listen to Kendrick Lamar, look at Beyonce's Lemonade and wonder, look at generativity. And talk to the black people you work with if you work with any at work. Talk to them. Listen to them. Listen to Thelonious Monk. Listen to Miles Davis. Celebrate surviving and thriving with me. Finally, I offer you a challenge. A number of years ago, I was scheduled to preach at the Deerfield Unitarian Church just outside Chicago. And it's just a few miles north of the city, and as I'm a terrible driver, I always get lost, even with GPS. It's just hopeless. And as I got lost, I made a couple wrong turns, and I ended up backing up into a private driveway on this quiet Sunday morning. And then all of a sudden, I hear that infamous sound that I get used to hearing, whoop, whoop, whoop. And I look to see the red and blue lights, and they pull me over. And I'm like, now, at this point, by the time I collect myself and get into my whole routine, because there's a routine that black people have when we hear that sound. It's very complex. Everybody has their own ways they do it. We share ideas on what to do when we hear it. It's like a whole cottage industry on what to do when you hear whoop, whoop. So I go in through my routine. I turn down my hip hop music and turn on the classical station. These are things you got to do. I want to go home. So I make sure I can reach my necessities without leaving or moving in any direction that could, and I roll down the window just a teeny bit and I stick the stuff out. That's the way my father taught me to do it. And I get into my most subservient, submissive, sort of slave voice. Oh, no, officer, what happened? Did I do something wrong? You know, that exactly. I'm thinking about only one thing while I'm demeaning myself and doing this. I'm thinking about going home to my wife and my children and my community. I want to go home. And I've got to preach about 500 feet from here. And at this point, I can see some people going in and out of the church. So the cop and I do that little dance that we do with black drivers and white officers, but he took a long time to do it. And he was most concerned, even though my robe was tossed over the back seat with my stole and everything, he was most concerned that I was going. He says, where are you going? Now, you shouldn't have to answer that question. Where am I going? It's none of your business where I'm going. But I said, well, I'm going to that church right there. I'm going to preach. Is that okay, boss? You know, not quite like that, but that's what I was trying to get to, you know. It's pretty good, huh? Yeah. I said, I'm going to that church to preach. And it sounded very suspicious to him. You know, Deerfield, Illinois, very fancy. It's where all the big fancy people play. Michael Jordan used to live there, but he was Michael Jordan. He didn't get stopped. But so as I sat there right in front of the church, I could see one of my colleagues out of the corner of my eye standing outside, looking almost dead at me and the cop. Now, I know this guy, but he was frozen. And eventually something kicks in and he walks over to me. He must have seen my eyes looking at him from that long distance, saying, man, get over here. Get over here. Well, eventually he did, and all of a sudden, officer, when my colleague, a Unitarian Universalist ministerial colleague I've known for 10 years prior to that, but not great, but we knew each other, finally meanders over. The cop goes, oh, no problem. Okay, it just takes off. Okay. So after the service, I was kind of pissed off at my friend because he was standing there too long. I said, you know, you saw what happened out there. I said, man, why didn't you come over sooner? And I said, help me out. And in fact, I came up with another expression. I said, don't just help me out, wipe me out. You know, wipe me out, man. You know, like white person, come on over here and everything will be fine, you know. I thought it would be a cute bumper sticker, wipe me out. It's a real thing, you know. But he had no answer for me, and he said he needed to think about why he froze. So years later, like, I don't know, 8 years later, I've been here 5 years already. Yeah, 8 years later, he writes a sermon about this incident. Like 8 years later, he writes it. He's in California somewhere now. And from the sermon, he said, he said it to me, he says, I let my colleague down. I looked at her the same way I looked at black men getting stopped by the police. I assumed she did something wrong. I looked at my colleague the same way. The what-ifs of that frightful situation play over and over in my head. Since then, I have made a commitment to show up, lean in, and walk towards. We're still friends. We both learned a lot that day. So my friends in Rochester, sanctuary is about a few seconds. Where you show up, where you show up. Standing on the curb when ICE is coming, after your landscaper or your house cleaner. You might have to open the door and say, come in. Speak and do and bring sanctuary into being. I'll end with something I saw. I like many people that can't watch these videos, but I watch them all, of black people being, you know, beaten up by the police or manhandled. And there's one I saw that you really should watch. It gives me great hope. It's in Las Vegas. The black man is selling water on the side of the road in downtown Las Vegas. And the police have him in a chokehold. He has no weapon. He's down on the ground, but they're choking him, and then the other one's sitting on his back. And people are walking by, and then this one woman, middle-aged white woman, I can tell by her voice, is standing there filming the whole thing, talking to the officer. You need training. That's no way to treat somebody. She's laying into these cops like nobody's business while she's filming this whole thing. While she's filming the whole thing. She's whiting somebody out. Then she yells out, tell me your phone number so I can call your people. I thought that was just amazing. we can help one another out find those seconds of sanctuary, no matter where they are. Let's do it. Let's extend our hands, and let's be the Unitarian Universalists that we all are called to be. Blessed be. Go now, not in peace, but in fury. We cannot survive a democracy where so many things are wrong right now, and so many people are hurting in El Paso and in Dayton, Ohio today. Thoughts and prayers are good. Banning assault rifles might be better. Taking this violence seriously is our only hope to preserve our democracy. So let us all leave here and be patriots to our country. Blessed be.